The air, thick and oppressive, hung heavy with a suffocating blend of exotic incense, rich myrrh oil, and a subtly metallic tang, an almost palpable essence of fear that permeated every carved wooden beam and silk-draped surface. The only light struggling to penetrate this profound gloom emanated from the dying sun, its weary rays filtering through countless layers of vibrant, heavy silk curtains. These luxurious fabrics cast the entire opulent chamber in a sickly, jaundiced amber glow, a hue that seemed to reflect the decay hidden beneath the surface of royal grandeur. We found ourselves not amidst the renowned splendor of Susa, a city famed for its magnificent palaces and gardens, nor in the majestic, awe-inspiring ruins of Persepolis, where colossal statues once guarded the heart of an empire. Instead, our perspective plunged deep inside the clandestine and heavily guarded private fortress of the king, into the forbidden and secretive realm known as the Haram. Within these impenetrable walls, time seemed to bend and distort, and the very air vibrated with unspoken tension, a silent terror that clung to the very fabric of existence here. The swift, practiced fingers of the attending servants moved with an unnerving agility across soft, trembling skin, meticulously spreading perfumed oil in an atmosphere of hushed, quivering silence. Their hands, though skilled, shook perceptibly, but not from any chill in the air. Rather, their tremors betrayed an intrinsic, deep-seated fear, a silent acknowledgement of the dire circumstances unfolding. The young girl before them, destined for an encounter that dwarfed her understanding, was barely more than a child, her delicate frame almost too frail for the immense weight of her fate. Her collarbones jutted out sharply beneath the gossamer thin veil that barely concealed her budding form, a stark contrast to the luxurious preparations. She possessed no knowledge of her precise position in this grim, unspoken lottery, whether she was the 100th or perhaps the 1,000th in an endless, tragic procession of lives consumed by imperial whim. Here, within the sealed confines of the Haram, numbers had long since ceased to hold any genuine meaning or solace. Only one terrifying, immutable truth remained, a chilling realization that permeated her very blood with every terrified heartbeat, accelerating the rhythm of her despair. The man, the unseen presence waiting in the adjoining, dimly lit room, was far more than just the King of Kings, a title that already commanded ultimate reverence and dread across vast swathes of the known world. He was not merely the omnipotent ruler of millions, his dominion stretching from the mystical lands of India to the culturally rich city-states of Greece. Nor was he simply the living embodiment of Ahura Mazda, the very personification of divine authority on earth. In a cruel twist of fate, a profound, gut-wrenching irony that defied all natural law and human decency, he was also her father. Outwardly, the colossal Persian Empire, with its vast territories and sophisticated administration, stood as the undisputed wonder of the ancient world, a colossal, unstoppable engine of conquest, governance, and monumental achievement. But this outward facade of unparalleled power and order concealed a festering, internal corruption. Xerxes I, bearing the august title King of Kings, commanded an unimaginable trove of wealth and wielded absolute, unquestionable power over life and death, his decrees shaping the destinies of entire nations and countless individuals. Yet power, when it is allowed to swell unchecked and reaches its most extreme, unbridled form, does not confine its dominion solely to ruling lands and subjects. It becomes a malignant force, slowly but inexorably corroding the very soul of the one who wields it, transforming the individual from within. It relentlessly demands greater and greater transgressions, pushing the boundaries of morality and ethics, simply to provide a fleeting, increasingly desperate sensation of being truly alive, of still possessing agency and influence in a world already entirely conquered. And behind the formidable gold-plated walls of his private palace, Within the labyrinthine chambers that were meticulously guarded by silent eunuchs, where no mortal law, no societal custom, and no whisper of ethical restraint could ever possibly enter, absolute power mutated grotesquely into absolute depravity. This, then, is not the conventional grand narrative of epic battles, of armies clashing on vast plains or fleets contending on turbulent seas. It is, instead, a harrowing and deeply personal story of a luxurious prison, elegantly draped in the finest silks and adorned with precious jewels, yet a prison nonetheless, and of a heinous crime buried meticulously by the very bloodline that conceived it. It is a secret so profoundly dark, so inherently repugnant, that even the most unflinching and audacious Greek historians of the era, men like Herodotus, only dared to whisper of it in veiled allusions, never once committing its explicit details to the permanence of written scroll. To truly grasp the depth and horror of Xerxes's ultimate moral fall, we must first endeavor to comprehend the intricate, insidious machinery that not only created him as a monarch, but also enabled and shaped the darkest aspects of his character. The royal Persian Haram was by no means a mere pleasure palace, a simple collection of concubines and entertainers designed solely for the king's ephemeral amusement. It was, in its essence, a highly sophisticated and utterly ruthless political institution, functioning as a state within a state, operating under its own arcane and hidden laws, a realm entirely separate from the public administration of the empire. When Xerxes ascended to the formidable throne, inheriting the immense dominion from his legendary father, Darius the Great, he did not just inherit vast territories, sprawling cities, and loyal armies. He also inherited this meticulously constructed, all-encompassing system of absolute control, a shadowy administrative apparatus designed to consolidate and maintain power in the most intimate and insidious ways. The harem, therefore, was not an accidental development. It was a carefully engineered tool of power, a living mechanism built with deliberate intent deep within the secure confines of the palace. Its architectural design was a testament to its purpose. It was structured so that no one, absolutely no one, could ever enter its sacred and forbidden precincts without the express personal permission of the king himself, and crucially, no one who entered could ever, under any circumstances, hope to leave its gilded confines. It was a self-contained universe of eternal captivity. Endless corridors, winding like a serpent's path, led through monumental cedar doors, each as thick and unyielding as solid stone, guarding passage to inner gardens where the sunlight, once it managed to filter in, seemed trapped forever, never truly reaching the outside world again. Inside these formidable walls, isolated from the world beyond, lived hundreds upon hundreds of women, a vibrant yet deeply tragic living mosaic meticulously assembled from the spoils of Persia's numerous conquests. There were, among them, princesses from defeated kingdoms, sent as poignant tokens of enforced peace, their royal birthrights now serving as mere diplomatic pawns. Daughters of influential noble Persians were offered as solemn tributes, their youthful lives a sacrifice intended to secure and reaffirm their families' unswerving loyalty to the imperial crown. And then there were the countless dancers, talented musicians, and beautiful concubines, gathered from every single province and corner of the vast empire, each possessing her own designated rank within a strict, unyielding hierarchy of servitude. All of them, without exception, were considered the absolute property of the empire, mere inventory in the king's vast possessions, their individual identities subsumed by their collective fate. And who, one might ask, truly ran this luxurious, silk-draped prison? The answer lay with the eunuchs. These men, meticulously chosen and surgically stripped of their ability to father children, were, with that emasculation, simultaneously stripped of all conventional human loyalties to blood or lineage, to family or clan. Their only undivided allegiance was directed solely and absolutely to the king. They were the Haram's dedicated administrators, its vigilant spies, its unyielding gatekeepers, and, when the dark occasion demanded it, its silent executioners. They held complete, unchallengeable control over access to the king's inner sanctum, the distribution of food and precious jewels, the meticulously scheduled visiting calendar, and most importantly, the flow and suppression of all information, ensuring no secret ever escaped. Every woman who entered the Haram was subjected to a meticulous, often brutal, transformation process. They were rigorously trained in the arts of pleasure, in enchanting music, in graceful dance, and in the delicate nuances of refined conversation, skills designed solely to captivate and serve their royal master. Some, through a carefully cultivated intimacy and keen political acumen, might even aspire to subtly influence the king's monumental decisions, wielding a fragile, fleeting power. But it was, without question, a deadly, high-stakes game of unparalleled risk. A carefully placed whisper, delivered at precisely the opportune moment, could indeed elevate a concubine to the exalted status of a royal wife, granting her immense, albeit precarious, influence. Conversely, a single ill-judged glance, an unintentional misstep at the wrong time, could just as swiftly mean instant, brutal death, a swift end to all aspirations. It was a suffocating world defined by silent conspiracies, by meticulously crafted false smiles that concealed true intentions, and by unseen daggers metaphorically hidden beneath the folds of exquisite silk sleeves. It was, in its perverse perfection, the ultimate prison, a golden cage, undeniably beautiful on the outside, where the inmates were exquisitely dressed in the finest, most opulent fabrics and fed the richest, most delectable foods. Yet they were simultaneously stripped forever of their fundamental autonomy, their freedom, and their very self-determination. And within the gilded confines of this meticulously constructed cage, a new and far more insidious tragedy began to take root, one that even its cynical creators, with all their foresight, had not fully anticipated or understood. Children were being born within its oppressive walls, their innocent cries echoing through corridors steeped in adult despair. When a concubine, herself a prisoner, gave birth to a daughter, that child's fate was irrevocably sealed from the very moment of her first, fragile cry. These girls, Xerxes' own daughters by his many concubines, grew up confined within the very same walls that had become a gilded prison for their mothers. They were, technically, princesses, born of royal blood, yet they possessed no genuine status, no recognized position or future within the empire's rigid social structure. Unlike the legitimate daughters born of royal wives, who were meticulously prepared for politically advantageous marriages with powerful princes or influential noblemen from other kingdoms. These Haram-born princesses were accorded no such privilege, no such hope. Their existence was relegated to a terrifying, ambiguous gray zone. They were undeniable carriers of royal blood, a fact that gave them a dangerous, inherent value to the king, yet they were simultaneously treated as mere components of the Haram's vast, impersonal inventory, possessions to be catalogued and controlled. From their earliest childhood, their entire world was this bewildering, isolating labyrinth of hidden passages and unspoken rules. They watched their mothers and hundreds of other women exist in a state of eternal, agonizing waiting, always waiting for the king's capricious call, a summons that could bring either fleeting favor or profound despair. They breathed an atmosphere thick with the stench of rivalry, the corrosive poison of jealousy, and the ever-present, humiliating specter of sexual submission. Our omniscient gaze now pierces through the layers of time to witness their chilling indoctrination, their earliest lessons encompassing how to walk with appropriate deference, how to speak with carefully measured words, and how to use their eyes to convey unspoken understanding. But above all else, they were taught, relentlessly, how to obey without question. They were explicitly and implicitly indoctrinated with the chilling truth that their bodies did not and would never belong to them. They belonged wholly and absolutely to the empire, and the empire, in its ultimate autocratic manifestation, was the king himself. Meanwhile, the man who had sired them, the absolute monarch, was undergoing a profound and deeply troubling transformation of his own. After a series of catastrophic military defeats against the determined and fiercely independent Greeks, most notably the humiliating naval defeat at the Battle of Salamis, Xerxes, once a confident conqueror, grew increasingly paranoid, deeply insecure, and terrifyingly cruel. He had boldly attempted to conquer the expansive outside world, to extend his imperial dominion across the Aegean and beyond, but he had failed spectacularly in that grand ambition. Now, in the bitter aftermath of defeat, he turned his insatiable desire for control inward, determined with an almost insane resolve to rule as a living god over the only realm he could still fully and unequivocally control: the sequestered confines of his harem. This is precisely the point where the psychology of limitless, unchallengeable power begins its slow, insidious process of rotting the soul from within. When a man can possess anything and everything he desires, when every whim can be instantly gratified, the very act of gratification inevitably becomes dull, predictable, and ultimately boring. When hundreds of the empire's most exquisitely beautiful women are perpetually ready and willing to submit to his every command, mere beauty itself becomes a meaningless spectacle, devoid of all intrinsic value. The thrill of simple submission, once a source of perverse pleasure, loses its tantalizing edge, its power to excite. Absolute power, having exhausted the mundane pursuit of satisfaction, then ceases to seek it. Instead, it begins to crave transgression, a breaking of boundaries. It needs stronger, more potent stimuli, ever newer and more outrageous moral boundaries to shatter, just to feel a fleeting, desperate flicker of being truly alive, of still possessing agency and power in a world that has otherwise yielded entirely. Greek historians from that tumultuous era, particularly the meticulous Herodotus, recorded the first chilling warning signs of this escalating depravity. They meticulously recounted tales of Xerxes' growing, unsettling obsession with his own brother's wife, a noblewoman named Mistes. When she, with a defiant courage that must have been born of desperation, rejected his illicit advances, the king, undeterred and utterly devoid of moral compass, simply turned his predatory desire toward her innocent daughter, who was, by blood, his own niece. He then forcibly compelled her into a perverse and entirely non-consensual relationship, setting a horrifying precedent. A disturbing and deeply destructive pattern was unmistakably forming. The once sacred boundaries of blood and family, the very bedrock of societal order, began to blur and then utterly dissolve in the increasingly deranged and self-aggrandizing mind of a man who genuinely believed himself to be divine, above all human strictures. To Xerxes, in his twisted megalomania, everything and everyone within his vast dominion, including his own kin, was merely an extension of his own omnipotent will, existing solely to serve his desires. He ruled nations, immense and diverse. He possessed women, countless and beautiful, and most terrifyingly, most utterly repugnantly, he possessed the very children he created, seeing them as extensions of his property. As his daughters, born within the gilded prison of the Haram, reached the tender age of puberty, the inherent ambiguity of their status within the palace became their undeniable sentence, a fate worse than death. They were never sent away for politically arranged marriages, as was customary for royal princesses. They were never allowed to leave the Haram's oppressive confines, their lives inextricably bound to its walls. Instead, they were deliberately kept, held captive for an unspoken, unutterably vile purpose, remaining always within the immediate reach of the same man who had sired them. The eunuchs, silent and observant, knew. The terrified servants knew. Their mothers, consumed by a helpless horror, knew. And they were all, without exception, horrified into an enforced, absolute silence. But within the Haram, silence was not merely a choice. It was the essential, undeniable currency of survival, the only shield against immediate oblivion. Anyone who dared to speak, to even whisper a single word of protest or reveal the unspeakable truths, vanished without a trace, their existence erased from memory as if they had never been. The intricate system of control, built layer upon layer, worked with terrifying, chilling perfection. It had been meticulously designed to protect the king's most heinous secrets at any cost, to ensure that the sanctity of his divine authority remained unquestioned. Transgression, once a mere abstract idea or a whispered rumor, was now, undeniably, becoming systemic, daily practice, an ingrained routine within the very heart of the empire. It was, in fact, becoming an institutionalized reality. The Greek physician and historian Ctesias, who notably served in the Persian court and thus had unparalleled access to royal archives and first-hand accounts, subtly hinted at the horrifying depth of corruption festering within. Though his original works survive only in fragments, preserved in the writings of later historians, these scattered pieces paint a chilling, vivid picture of moral decay so extreme, so utterly profound, that the darkest, most ancient taboos, those unspoken horrors that humanity instinctively recoiled from, became daily, accepted routine behind the thick, impenetrable palace walls. For these young princesses, the concept of coercion was not merely a threat. It was an absolute, inescapable fact of their existence, woven into the very fabric of their upbringing. How could one possibly utter a word of refusal? How could one say no to the man who embodied such an overwhelming confluence of power? He was simultaneously her biological father, her absolute king, and, in her world, her living God, a figure of supreme, terrifying authority. They were, in the most literal and tragic sense, prisoners born inside their cage, raised from infancy not for freedom or personal fulfillment, but for the exclusive pleasure and perverse gratification of their jailer, the man who held their very breath in his hands. The Haram's meticulously engineered system didn't just passively allow this monstrous behavior, it actively facilitated it, becoming an accomplice in the depravity. The eunuchs, whose singular, unwavering purpose in life was to anticipate and fulfill the king's every desire, no matter how dark or unconventional, dutifully prepared and delivered these innocent girls to him, their faces impassive, their souls perhaps long since deadened. There was no morality to be considered, no ethical dilemma to be debated within their ranks. There was only the cold, unfeeling efficiency of logistics, the smooth execution of royal command. The very architecture of the Haram itself, a masterpiece of secretive design, diligently preserved the unspeakable secret. Its isolated, opulent chambers, connected by an intricate network of hidden corridors and concealed passages, ensured with absolute certainty that whatever transpired within the king's most private rooms remained utterly invisible and profoundly unknown to the rest of the palace, to the world beyond, and even to the other inhabitants of the Haram itself. Xerxes, utterly suffocated by the immense, boundless weight of his own power, a power that had devoured his humanity, no longer saw people as individuals with agency or souls. He saw only objects, mere instruments to be utilized for his own twisted pleasure and dominance. The process of dehumanization was, for him, complete and irreversible. His daughters were not to him family in any recognizable sense. They were instead the most exclusive, most forbidden, and therefore the most cherished trophies of his vast and perverse collection, symbols of his absolute dominion over all aspects of existence. The air inside the Haram, already heavy with fear, grew perceptibly heavier with each passing season, each cycle of sun and moon. A pervasive, suffocating sense of paranoia seeped into the very walls, into the silk, into the stone, an omnipresent dread that tightened its grip on every soul trapped within. Mothers, desperate and heartbroken, made futile attempts to hide their young daughters, to shield them from the king's predatory gaze, but their efforts were ultimately useless, tragically in vain. The eunuchs, meticulous record-keepers of all within the Haram's domain, maintained precise, chilling records of every woman and every child, their ages, their lineage, their availability. When the king, in his chilling caprice, requested one of them, there was no possibility of appeal, no room for hesitation, no chance of defiance. The command of Xerxes was, in that moment, the ultimate law, and that law, in its terrifying finality, was utterly unquestionable, absolute. This was, after all, the very same man who, in a notorious display of irrational tyranny and boundless arrogance, had once ordered the tumultuous sea itself to be whipped with heavy chains, punishing the waves for daring to destroy his monumental bridge to Greece, a feat of engineering and hubris. Now, that same irrational, unhinged tyranny, that same godlike presumption of control, was turned inward, unleashed with devastating force toward his own innocent blood, toward the daughters he had fathered. The outer empire, vast and seemingly invincible, had already begun to show visible cracks, its grand facade threatened by internal dissent and external pressures. But the empire within his palace, the secret, depraved realm of the Haram, had long since descended into an unimaginable nightmare, a hell on earth. Even in ancient times, an era when moral standards and societal norms were vastly different, often far removed from our more enlightened contemporary sensibilities, the union of a father and his own daughter was universally considered an unthinkable, unspeakable taboo. It was a transgression so profound, so deeply ingrained in the human psyche as fundamentally wrong, that it stood as a horrifying boundary. In ancient Egypt, for instance, pharaohs sometimes married their sisters, a practice rooted in preserving royal bloodlines and divine lineage. In Persia itself, a unique custom known as sueda occasionally permitted marriages between first cousins or even half-siblings, again with the specific intent of preserving the purity and perceived divinity of the royal bloodline, ensuring its unblemished continuity. But the intimate relationship between a biological father and his daughter, that was the absolute, unbreachable final boundary, a line of moral rectitude that even the cruelest, most ruthless tyrants of history rarely, if ever, dared to cross, for fear of divine retribution or profound social condemnation. For Xerxes, however, that very untouchability, that extreme taboo, was precisely its most compelling allure, its irresistible draw. Breaking the ultimate universal taboo was, for him, the supreme proof of his ultimate unquestionable power, a perverse demonstration that he transcended all limits. It was an explicit, defiant declaration that he stood entirely above every conceivable law, be it human custom, natural order, or divine decree. It was the one remaining act, the final, most extreme transgression left to a man who already possessed everything imaginable, an act designed solely to make him feel that something, anything, still remained forbidden, still offered a new frontier for his limitless, corrupted will to conquer and defile. The air within the chamber, once merely thick, now hung oppressively heavy with the cloying sweetness of perfume, its fragrance almost suffocating. The young girl, the king's daughter, her eyes wide with uncomprehending terror, her small body rigid with fear, was led slowly inside the inner sanctum. The eunuchs, their faces rigid masks of stone, their expressions utterly devoid of emotion, took their designated posts outside the heavy cedar door. They heard everything that transpired within, every rustle, every soft sob, every sound. But they were meticulously trained to register nothing, to react to nothing. They were, in essence, breathing walls, living extensions of the palace's silent, unblinking surveillance. Our narrative view now shifts, piercing through the historical veil, to focus intently on the tortured mind of the victim herself. There is no concept of consent here, not even the cruelest illusion of it. No pretense of choice. How could she possibly deny the man who literally, unequivocally, held absolute power over her very life and her death? The man who was simultaneously her biological father, her all-powerful king, and her living God.